All right, let's talk a little bit more about MIDI tracks and audio tracks and why you would use one instead of the other. What's the difference between the two? Let's start over here with audio. And over here we'll put MIDI. As I mentioned before, audio has actual sound waves in it. Sound. MIDI has just a bunch of dots. No sound. Just messages. And the messages can be play this note. Play it this loud. Play it now. That's note on. Stop playing it. That's note off. You can also have MIDI do things like change the sound on your synth. And if you get really into it, you can control lights and other fun stuff. So that's the important thing first off to remember. Audio, on an audio track, there's actually sound in there like it was a tape recorder, right? Boom, magnetic tape has all these little electronic waves on it that play back and you hear the sound. MIDI, boom, no sound in there. These little notes have to have a synthesizer to play back. I'll explain more about that later, but just know audio has sound, MIDI has no sound. Audio is pretty heavy. When I explain to you how the computer actually records the sound and stores it, you'll see like, oh, it needs to use a lot more memory than MIDI does. MIDI just says, hey, play this note, play it now, play it this hard, and stop playing it. Okay, like 4 little tiny pieces of information compared to a bunch of information. So, audio is heavy, MIDI is light. Okay, some other differences here. Audio, let's say what you recorded is what you hear back. Okay, whereas MIDI, it's like you can change sounds for the same recorded performance. Okay? What else? Audio, it's tricky to fix individual notes in the track mix. Whereas in MIDI, it's easy to select one note, to delete, move, shift, whatever. Super easy. Audio, why would you need to use audio? Well, anything that you need to use a mic needs to be recorded as audio. And of course, the number one thing that we don't have a synthesizer that can play is your voice. You're not going to go out and buy a synthesizer that has Scotty's voice singing every possible consonant and vowel combination and every word in the English language. They don't exist. They might someday. Don't ever say never, because you never know what's going to happen. But for now, if you want to record your voice, you got to use a microphone that turns it into little electronic waves and turns it into audio waves in the computer, and you've got yourself a vocal track. So vocals, you need the audio. Guitars, they do have MIDI guitars, but they're awkward. Like, if every little MIDI note is a different white or black key on the keyboard, well, how do you deal with that kind of bendy stuff that you can do with guitars that makes it sound really tasty? Well, you can do it. They do have MIDI controllers that are guitars. It's just still pretty awkward. For guitar part, I'm going to find a great sound on my amp. I'm going to throw a microphone on that amp. I'm going to rock out on the guitar, and we're going to have an audio track for that guitar. Bass, for my album, I ended up playing for real bass, because it's a rock album and rock has to have real bass, if you ask me. But for doing modern music and EDM and stuff like that, there are so many cool bass patches. You could totally get away with playing bass on a synthesizer and having a MIDI track for the bass. That's kind of where I start with my electronic stuff. If I'm going back and making it into a rock track, I might replace the bass part with an actual amplifier recorded to audio. Same way with drums, actually. On my album, most of the time, I'm not the best drummer in the world, so I can think of really cool parts that are way cooler than what I can play, but I know how to arrange them, like kick, snare, snare, kick, snare, and make the drums exactly the way I would want to sound with little MIDI notes. And then I'll record the guitars like audio. I'll do some vocals, do some harmony vocals, maybe add a synth part on MIDI. Then at the end, I'll go over to my friend Bo's house and he'll help mix it, because he's got really cool equipment and knows how to use it 10 times better than I do. And he's an amazing drummer. So he'll be listening with his headphones and he'll know the drum part, and he'll just, have a bunch of drums mic'd. So you'll have an audio track for the kick drum. You'll have an audio track for the snare drum, for the toms and everything. And so he knows the arrangement that I created with MIDI using some pretty good synthesizer sampled drum sounds. It sounds pretty real. It can fool most people, but it's not the real deal compared to what Bo can do. And boom, now I've got the drum tracks as real live recorded with microphones, drums, and now they're audio. So those are the kind of choices and considerations when it comes to understanding the differences between audio and MIDI. One, audio has sound, MIDI just has codes of messages and little dots on the screen. They don't have any sound in them, they just tell something what to play. Without an instrument to be telling it what to play, you're not going to hear anything. We'll get into that more later. Remember, audio files are pretty heavy, whereas MIDI files are super light. Audio, what you record, it's like a tape machine. Boom. The tape hears the sound, records it, plays it back, and that's what you heard. But MIDI, let's say you've got a really cool keyboard part that you played. Sometimes you just can't do the same thing over again. There's so many variables that go into performing. Sometimes you make little mistakes that end up having, some qualities that are actually super cool. Well, if you did that in MIDI and the next day, somebody said, "Hey man, here's a cool piano sample that sounds really, really rich." And you're like, "Oh wow, I wish I would have had that yesterday." Well, it doesn't matter. You can actually take that new synthesizer sound and put it on this track, and you will have the exact same performance, the exact same dots, playing back the better piano sound now. Okay? Wait, that should be number 3 there. Number 4, editing. You can cut whole sections and paste them around in your timeline really easily, whether it's audio or whether it's MIDI. But if there's like that one wrong note, you're going, oh, it was the perfect solo except for that one note. Well, all of that sound is just going on at once inside your audio track. You can't go in there and just say, "Ew, I want to take that sound out, that mistake out." I mean, there are tricks to, when it comes to audio surgery that can kind of fix things like that. It's a little bit tricky. It depends on the mistake. In MIDI, boom, so easy. You just look and find the dot that it was the wrong thing to play, and you can select it. You can move it to the right note. Maybe it was just a little hair early. You can scoot it over a little bit. Maybe it's not so bad. You just played it a little too loud. You can actually select it and make it a little softer. Super easy to edit. Okay, and then the last thing is that, well, sometimes there are things that you just have to do in audio. Vocals and guitars, for one. And whereas over here, you got so many synth sounds and nice, realistic software instruments, we call them. And cool effects and stuff like that. Any of that stuff you could play through an amp, throw a microphone on it, and record the audio, but you can see why there's so many advantages to, at least at first, recording it as MIDI. It's easier to edit, and then later on, of course, you're going to have to turn it into an audio track mixed into what you finally listen to on your headphones, but that's mixing. Right now, we're talking about the 2 different kinds of tracks you can make at the very beginning. Audio tracks and MIDI tracks.